Mr. Speaker, and still I rise. And I rise, Mr. Speaker, as I always do, unbought, unbossed, unafraid, and now I must also add unelected, a liberated Democrat, truly liberated. Liberated to the extent that while I have been censured, I have not been silenced. While I have now been unelected, I will not be silent. My agenda remains the same. It is still the agenda that deals with the voices of those that are not heard in this House as they should be. The voices of the least, the last, and the lost. The least among us. Persons who don't inherit a legacy of much, but actually a legacy of poverty, not plenty. Persons who are among the lost in a society as rich as ours, where persons find themselves lost in places of despair, living in places that you and I would not consider a place habitable. The least and the lost, and of course the last. The last would be those persons who are the last to be hired and the first to be fired. The least, the last, and the lost. But I also represent other people, and I will continue to do so. I represent those persons who suffer invidious discrimination. They are among the LGBTQIA plus community. They are women. They are persons who are of the Islamic faith. They are persons who are currently suffering from anti-Semitism. They are persons who are suffering because of the color of their skin. So today I rise to speak on the topic, invidious discrimination emanating from the presidency. Invidious discrimination emanating from the presidency. And I'd like to call to the attention of the listening audience and viewing audience an article from the Huffington Post, the Huff Post. And this article is styled, "Trump used his go-to insult in interview after Nick's loss." That would not be the last game, of course, the game prior to this one. And after Nick's loss, and experts say it's a pattern. We're talking about his go-to insult. And I must commend Ms. Katie Mather for the outstanding job she has done with this article. It has the date June 9th, 2026 as its date of publication. I'd like to read some excerpts from this because I think it will give us an opportunity to understand how the Trump presidency has not only impacted what he does, but also some other aspects of society. So this is truly invidious discrimination emanating from the presidency. Let me read some excerpts. The first reads, "First take, host Stephen A. Smith slammed President Donald Trump on Tuesday morning after Trump told reporters on Monday night that Smith wouldn't be a good fit to run for president because you need a high IQ. My dear friends, if I may say brothers and sisters, because I truly believe that there's but one race, and that's the human race. So if I may just say my dear brothers and sisters, friends, you may call Stephen A. Smith many things. I probably would not agree with anything that is negative. I don't know a negative side of him. I know that he is opinionated, but that's not unusual in the United States of America to have people who are opinionated. It is especially not unusual here in the House of Representatives. So you might call him many things, but I don't believe that you can call him a person in need of a high IQ, implying that he has a low IQ. And it goes on to say this in this article. Stephen A. Smith is brilliant. And I say this without question, reservation, or hesitation. He is one of the most brilliant people that I have seen in the sports arena, but he goes beyond sports. He talks on a multiplicity of subjects all the time, and he acquits himself well on every topic that I've heard him speak on. Now, you don't have to agree with the person to understand the brilliance of the person. He has a brilliant mind, and I do believe that the president made this comment for dubious reasons. So let me continue reading from excerpts in the article. Trump's low IQ comment against Smith has racist implications. This is what the article says. Racist implications, and it referred to a racial dog whistle by linguistics and political experts, said Dr. Karen Anderson, a communication study professor at Colorado State University. This professor is making the point that when the president says these things about persons with low IQs, he is actually signaling to others. It is a racist dog whistle. The article goes on to say, what distinguishes a dog whistle from just an insult is it is designed to sound innocuous. The dog whistle is designed to sound as though, oh, it's harmless, just another thing someone is saying to be funny or cute. Well, not this dog whistle. And Anderson goes on to say, Anderson, who teaches courses in rhetoric, political communications, and gender and communications, told HuffPost, it is meant to be deniable. The virtue, the rhetorical appeal of a dog whistle is when you can deny that it functions in the way that it actually is designed to function. So this dog whistle is designed to appear to be innocuous, harmless, but its functionality is rooted in something else. He goes on to say that it is a term that white supremacists have historically used against people of color, and it's not the first time the president has publicly used it. Last month, he called House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries a thug and a low IQ person on Truth Social. This is where he speaks much of what he says to the public. But this term thug, let me focus on it for just a moment. Hakeem Jeffries, he calls a thug. That's demeaning. He does this to demean people of color, but then he adds the injury to this insult of low IQ. You can accuse Hakeem Jeffries of many things, but you cannot in any way produce the empirical evidence to show that he is a person with a low IQ. He is a brilliant man, a brilliant person who has the appeal that most people understand to be that of a person with great intellect. So when the president calls him a thug and a low IQ person on Truth Social, and he did this in April, this was a means by which he could demean and insult and use the term that those who live in the world of white supremacy embrace. This is something that they readily embrace, and they understand the dog whistle. They understand what the president really means when he says thug and low IQ. Let me go on. In April, he called Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson the new low IQ person on the court. The new low IQ person on the court. During the 2024 presidential election, Trump repeatedly described the former vice president, that would be Kamala Harris, as a low IQ individual. Note what all of these people have in common. Color, African Americans, persons who have reached great heights in terms of their professions, persons who are making a difference in a very positive way in our country. But the president would demean them by challenging their intellect, and in so doing, appeal to white supremacists who still believe that people of color have low intellect. Reading on, he applies it, meaning his low IQ comment, indiscriminately to black people in different walks of life and professions. This is what Anderson said. That's where it reveals that it's a dog whistle because it doesn't relate to anything else. Goes on to say, experts say the low IQ insult has a storied past. That is a long history in the United States of this low IQ dog whistle. This is Anderson speaking again. Goes on to say, during the colonial era, white male elites took for granted that they were cognitively superior to women and people of color, and thus divinely appointed for leadership. Well, that explains a lot of the sexism that we have seen. That explains a lot of what we have seen when persons decide that they're simply going to reduce you to something less than human by assigning you to the primate family and calling you an ape, or saying that you're related to the apes, or somehow you are an ape, reducing people of color to animals that are not as superior to life forms as some others. These animals are not persons. They exist, and we want them to exist, but we don't want people to compare human beings to these animals. And the president does this. He has compared a former president and first lady to apes. We don't like to talk about this, I've found. That there are many people who would just rather see this just kind of go away, and let's let that just be something that he's done. Well, the president never apologized for it after saying someone else actually posted it, but he never apologized. And by the way, I don't ask him to apologize. I ask him to just tell the truth, that this was wrong, that it should not have been posted, and that he would not allow this to happen again. That would be more suitable for the means by which he can atone for his transgression. But he hasn't done any of that. He tends to double down. Well, this article goes on to remind us that IQ was used to justify heinous behavior like racial segregation and forced sterilization. Now, this is something another social scientist, Figueroa, has called to our attention in this article. Forced sterilization because of IQ actually happened in the United States of America. We have much to atone for. As we approach this great anniversary, we would have people believe that all is well. All is not well. And all won't be well until some of our transgressions have been properly addressed. This notion that you should sterilize a woman because you believe that she has a low IQ is more than simply a crime that is statutorily illegal. It is really a crime against humanity to engage in this kind of conduct. And this actually happened. Racial segregation. After we ended the enslavement of African Americans in this country, Africans from America, living in America, who were at the time, much of the time, not declared citizens. So let's just say Africans in America. After slavery was ended, the enslavement of people for some 240 years, the people who had a hand in building this very facility, the Capitol, the White House, roads, bridges, planted seeds, harvested crops, fed the nation. They were the economic foundational mothers and fathers of the country. These persons, after we ended the enslavement of these persons. Then we embarked upon convict leasing, which is another form of racism. Slavery itself was rooted in racism. And this whole notion of convict leasing, which would allow people who violated some code to be placed in the hands of other persons, leased out from the government or some arm of the government, and many of them died as leased persons, convicts who have been leased. There's a grave near Houston, Texas, with 95 bodies in it, persons who were convicts and leased, all in a common grave. This kind of behavior was justified based upon IQ. These were less than human. They were akin to the lower forms of animals that we would call primates. So as such, you can do almost anything to them that you like, and people did. So this forced sterilization and this segregation, which was a form of invidious discrimination rooted in racism, segregation rooted in racism, many of us alive today experienced lawful racism in the form of segregation. Lawful racism in the form of segregation in this country. Many of us went to back doors, drank from colored water fountains, sat in the back of the bus, locked up in the bottom of the jail. Many of us suffered this form of invidious discrimination known as segregation, which is rooted in racism. We, the people, decided that we would no longer have this form of invidious discrimination exist lawfully, so we ended it lawfully, but we didn't end it as it relates to the practice. Invidious discrimination against people of color still exists to this day in this country. And people who would say that it doesn't exist and say that repeatedly, who are in high places, those comments are based in racism. If you are saying repeatedly that people of color are not discriminated against in this country, and you're saying it in public spaces, and again, you're saying it repeatedly, you, my friend, are a racist. You are. Nobody bothered to tell you before now. I know you didn't get the word, but I'm here to tell you that people who do this, to demean other people, to say that they are less than, that is racist rhetoric, and persons who do this regularly with intentionality, you are a racist. Continuing. As I indicated, IQ was used to justify heinous behavior like racial segregation and forced sterilization. That thinking, it reads here, was amplified in the late 1900s by a popular book titled The Bell Curve, which falsely claimed that IQ differences between racial groups were biological. Biological. Phrenology, another form of race science that claims skull shapes determined intelligence, has also been completely discredited by the scientific community because of how often it was used to uphold scientific racism and gender stereotypes throughout the U.S. and Europe. Friends, people of color and women have suffered greatly in this country under the color of law, under the guise of science that was rooted in racism. We have to change this. This cannot continue in this country. And until we change this, we cannot truly say that all persons are treated equally. Although they are created equally, they are not treated equally. And we cannot say that liberty and justice for all exists when we address ourselves and the Pledge of Allegiance. It just doesn't happen. It's not the case. There is not liberty and justice for all in the United States of America. But let us continue. It reads, roughly 8 in 10 of Trump's low IQ attacks target black and brown people. This is what data shows. Roughly 8 in 10 target black and brown people. We're talking about empirical evidence now. Trump has been using his dog whistle frequently. Between January 20th of 2025 and April 25th of 2026, Trump posted low IQ or a variation of this phrase 24 times. Let me stop for just a moment and deal with the variation of the phrase. Because there are some people who don't say low IQ, they will say stupid. They will say, oh, black people are stupid. Or they'll say a particular black person is stupid. And in so doing, they will say, now, I really mean this in the sense of the way the word stupid is defined. So they use stupidity. And they use this in the sense of referring to the person's intellect. Again, another means by which persons are using dog whistles to demean people of color. And this dog whistle that the president uses has permeated what I call racist radio. Racist radio. Yes, racist radio exists. Not all radio is racist, but there is a large segment, a subset of radio that is racist. And they are on the air daily, utilizing terms such as stupidity, depicting people of color as less than human beings. And they've done it to the extent that they've normalized it within the circle that they reside in. They've normalized it. People just come to accept it. Well, I don't. I refuse to accept what racist radio does routinely. And the president, who is at the top of this chain of unscrupulous behavior, he's at the very top. The president shapes the tone and tenor for all of these things that happen beneath him. Much of what we are seeing today is being perpetrated and perpetuated because the president does it. So why can't others do it? People see it this way. So we have this racist radio that is constantly perpetrating and perpetuating racist dog whistles in the form of IQ, in the form of depicting persons as less than human who are persons of color, and in the form of using language other than low IQ, such as stupid. Stupidity has become another dog whistle for racist radio. And they know that I speak truth, but they rarely have the truth spoken such that they are exposed. So those of you who are listening to it and enjoying it, you're enjoying racism. And as long as you continue to enjoy it and support it by the products being advertised on those stations, you're supporting racism. Racism exists in the public arena because in many instances, people are buying the products that the racists purvey. The racists sell the products on their radio stations, they advertise the products, you buy them from those stations, and as a result, you are supporting racism. I refuse to do it. Racism is something that we have to combat. Sexism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, all of the various invidious phobias. So let me repeat this, it bears repeating. Roughly 8 in 10 of Trump's low IQ attacks target black or brown people, data shows. Goes on to say, Trump has been using this dog whistle frequently between January 20th, 2025 and April 25th, 2026. Trump posted low IQ or a variation of the phrase 24 times, according to a study by Truth Out, a nonprofit news organization. 8 out of 10 posts were directed at black or brown people. In the first 10 months of his second term, Trump did not refer to any white person as someone with low IQ. I'm going to repeat that. In the first 10 months of his second term, Trump did not refer to any white person as someone with low IQ. These are the kinds of things people don't want to hear. But you have to know the truth so that you can free your minds. I've read someplace that if you know the truth, it will set you free. I want to free your minds. This will free you. Some of you choose not to be free, and there's nothing that will be said to free your minds because you choose not to be free. There is no one so blind as he who chooses not to see. Not as he who cannot see, but he who chooses not to see. And there are many people who choose not to see. No white person referred to with low IQ. And the article goes on to indicate it is designed to signal a specific audience that a speaker shares the ideology or belief systems that they shares their ideology or belief system. That's what these dog whistles are designed to do, to say to other people, hey, don't worry, I got your back. I believe that just as you believe that they have low IQs, so it's okay for you to say it on racist radio now. It's all right. You can call persons stupid. You can say low IQ. You can do it with impunity because the president is doing it. Well, it's not all right, and you're not going to do it with impunity because you're going to be exposed. This goes on to indicate that Trump uses it to refer to black people and predominantly, but not exclusively, black women. Predominantly, but not exclusively, black women. I stand in defense of black women. I stand in defense of the black women that he has called persons with low IQs. I defend Maxine Waters. I defend Vice President Kamala Harris. I defend Jasmine Crockett. I defend the women that this president would demean with a racist comment. And that's what it is. It is racist. Racist commentary, constantly repeated over the airwaves. And it goes on to say, I think in his mind, this is a person speaking now of the president, I think in his mind, because it doesn't explicitly refer to race, he feels that it is easy to deny that it's a racist label. My friends, he can deny it, but there are some of us who see through it. I'm here to tell you that it is racist, and it is a racist label. This article concludes with this language. By repeating the phrase openly, as is done on racist radio quite regularly, remember, we're talking today about invidious discrimination emanating from the presidency. And I chose this topic, emanating from the presidency, because I wanted to talk about how it is permeating society. It starts there at the top with this president, and it permeates society. Now, the argument can be made that it was here and it was before this president took office, but he has popularized it. He has normalized it. He has made it such that people in racist radio use it regularly and feel as though they are doing something noble by demeaning people of color and women and others as well, members of the LGBTQIA+ community. So he says, I think that in his mind, because he doesn't explicitly refer to race, he feels that it's easy to deny and that it's a racist label, The final comment, by repeating the phrase openly, the practice further popularizes the concept. By repeating it, he popularizes the racist comment. As another person who spoke, Harris, once put it, Trump's language seems to have become less a dog whistle and more a bullhorn. Less a dog whistle, more a bullhorn. So friends, here we are. We have a president of the United States of America who routinely uses racist commentary to refer to people of color. Routinely. Does it without a thought as to how it impacts the lives of the people he refers to, the persons that he's calling low IQ. Doesn't really understand, maybe he does understand and doesn't care. But he should consider how it impacts the lives of people, how it signals to other people that the persons are less than, and how it can cause some people to respond to them in a very adverse way. But we have to say to the president, and I do so today, Mr. President, if you are using this kind of commentary, as you do, and you continue to do it routinely, someone has to tell you what you're doing. And here's what you're doing, Mr. President. You are bringing the country itself to a level of concern for others such that we are not seen as we were once seen, as the country with the Statue of Liberty, the notion that there's liberty and justice for all in our Pledge of Allegiance, the notion that we truly respect all people and that all persons are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You're causing people across the globe to see us differently. You're causing people across the globe to understand that the United States is undergoing something that they never thought they'd see, and quite frankly, I'm amazed myself. So, Mr. President, there's only one thing that I can say to you. When you do this, you are not only using a racist dog whistle, you are a racist. That kind of terminology utilized the way you do it regularly makes you the racist who has now given other racists the license to say what they say, openly and notoriously normalizing racism. As we approach the 250th anniversary, Mr. President, you should be ashamed. But there's no shame in you. You've already demonstrated this with your behavior over the many years that you've had a public voice. You've already demonstrated there's no shame in you. So because you have no shame in you, Mr. President, I would call to your attention that while I am unbought, unbossed, unafraid, and unelected, censured but not silenced, Mr. President, there is still a countdown to impeachment. And Mr. President, it is just a matter of time. Your day of reckoning will come. Someone is going to stand in the well of this House of Representatives and is going to introduce articles of impeachment against you, and these articles are going to pass in this House of Representatives. Before that person does it, however, I believe that there will be someone who will introduce articles to lay the foundation for the actual articles that will later on pass the House of Representatives. There's always someone who lays the foundation for things. Foundation was laid at the Edmund Pettus Bridge for the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Foundation was laid to eliminate invidious discrimination in busing, on bus lines, when Rosa Parks took a seat and ignited a spark that started a civil rights movement. So someone's going to lay the foundation. And Mr. President, you should know you will be impeached again. You will be 3 times impeached. Mr. Speaker, with that said, I, Al Green, a proud, unbought, unbossed, unafraid, unelected, truly liberated Democrat, I yield back the balance of my time.